All right, let's dive into this deep dive into U.S. immigration law. We're going to be looking at some stuff from the National Immigrant Justice Center. They have these Know Your Rights resources that I think are really helpful. Whether you're, dealing with all this yourself
Right.
or just want to be more informed,
Yeah.
it can be overwhelming for sure.
Yeah, it's a lot.
So hopefully we can make it a little bit easier to digest.
The NIJC does do a good job, though, of breaking things down, making it, more manageable pieces of information.
Yeah, and they really hit hard right away with that point that everyone in the U.S. has certain rights no matter what their immigration status is. So why is that such a big deal?
I think it's important because there's so much misinformation out there.
Mm.
And, we hear all the time about people who are
Mm-hmm.
maybe afraid to actually stand up for themselves because they're worried about their status.
Yeah.
But it's just not true. Everyone has basic protections. Everyone deserves to be treated fairly under the law.
So it's not just about, what's written down, but it's also about actually feeling empowered to say, hey, wait a minute.
Exactly. And that's why knowing what your rights are is so important, especially in those situations, when you're dealing with ICE or other authorities.
Right. And speaking of those high pressure situations, the NIJC has a guide called What to Do If You or a Loved One is Detained. And it seems like from the very beginning, the first things you do are super important.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, those initial steps can really, it's like setting the foundation for the entire case.
And they really stress that point of not signing anything without a lawyer.
Absolutely, yeah. You don't want to. That first encounter with IC can really set the tone for everything that follows.
Right, right. So you really want to protect yourself from any, missteps right away.
Yeah.
And they also mention how important it is to get the person's alien registration number, that A number, and where they're being held as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that information is so crucial for anyone who's going to be representing them, for their legal representation and just for tracking their case.
So it's
And of course, getting a good immigration attorney is absolutely essential.
Right, so it's like a multi-pronged approach there in those first few steps.
Yeah.
Now, the NIJC also talks about this possibility of, increased enforcement and this idea of mass deportation. And it's something that comes up in the news all the time. So I'm curious how that, how do those concerns connect to what we were just talking about, the individual steps to take if someone is detained?
I think it really highlights that sense of urgency. It's not just about reacting after something happens. It's about having a plan ahead of time.
Yeah.
Knowing your options.
Yeah, being prepared.
Yeah. And that's why they also offer all these practical tips, for staying safe, feeling empowered in your day-to-day life.
Right. So it's like having that safety net, not just for the worst case scenario, but
it's everyday life.
Yeah, it's about just navigating daily life.
Yeah.
With that awareness, that confidence.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those practical tips. This Know Your Rights. If you encounter IC guide really stood out to me. What are some of the things that people should really try to remember? Honestly, one of the most important things is just remembering that you have the right to remain silent and that you have the right to an attorney. I know it's easy to feel pressured in that moment.
Right. Yeah.
But remembering those two basic things can make a world of difference.
And what about those situations where, someone might feel threatened? Does the NIJC talk about that at all?
Yeah, they talk about, staying calm, not running away from ICE.
Yeah.
And having those emergency contact numbers memorized. Just having that information in your head.
Just those little things can help.
Yeah, just little things to make you feel more prepared.
Right.
Less vulnerable.
So it's about knowing your rights, but also knowing how to assert them in that really intense moment. Now, what about people who, haven't had any direct interaction with IC yet? Is there anything they can do to be proactive?
Absolutely. The NIJC has a whole guide on family protection in case of deportation. And that's something I think everyone should think about, even if they don't feel like they're at immediate risk.
Right. Okay, so tell me more about that. What are some steps people can take to kind of prepare for that possibility, even if it seems far off?
Well, it all comes down to having those important documents in place. Things like a power of attorney, thinking about guardianship for your children, all those things that can really make a huge difference if a family is facing separation.
That's a really good point. It's not just about reacting.
Exactly.
It's about those steps you can take. And I like that the NIJC actually provides specific info on guardianships in Illinois and Indiana.
Yeah.
It's very, tailored, very helpful.
It shows how dedicated they are to serving those local communities. It's not just general advice. It's really targeted to the people they work with.
And that's so important because everyone's situation is a little bit different.
Right. It's not one size fits all at all.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about some of those proactive steps, but now I want to get into how do we actually navigate this ever-changing landscape of immigration law? It's like a moving target sometimes.
Yeah, it can feel that way.
So how do we stay on top of these updates, and what are some of the most recent developments that have caught your attention?
Well, the NIJC does a really good job of keeping their resources updated. They're constantly adding new information, revising things, which is so important in such a, fast-paced field.
It's like a whirlwind sometimes, trying to keep up with everything.
It really is, yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that I saw recently that kind of caught my eye was about the parole in place program for military families. It was actually vacated by a court ruling just back in November of 2024.
Oh, wow. So this is very recent then.
Yeah, very recent.
So what does that mean for the families who are relying on that program?
It's a pretty big setback for those families, Parole in place was meant to provide relief for spouses and children of U.S. military personnel. So now that it's been vacated, it leaves them in a really tough spot.
So what happens now? Are there any other options for them while all this legal stuff gets sorted out?
It's really complicated, to be honest.
Yeah.
The NIJC is definitely following all the developments closely. There may be appeals and legal challenges and things like that, but for now, it's kind of a waiting game.
Yeah, it's a lot of uncertainty.
A lot of uncertainty, for sure.
So it just shows how important it is to have good legal advice. And speaking of that, the NIJC also has this whole guide on how to avoid immigration fraud, which seems incredibly important.
Oh, it's so critical. I mean, unfortunately, there are people out there who prey on folks who are just trying to navigate this system.
Yeah, and they're already vulnerable. So how can people protect themselves? What are some red flags they should be looking out for?
Well, I would say one of the biggest red flags is anyone who guarantees you a specific outcome. Immigration law is very complex. No one can promise you anything.
That makes sense. Yeah, okay, so what about the people who are offering these services?
Yeah, that's another thing to be careful about. The NIJC makes a distinction between attorneys and accredited representatives.
Okay, what's the difference there?
So attorneys, they're licensed by state bar associations, whereas accredited representatives are authorized by the Department of Justice.
Okay.
Both can provide legal help. But it's so important to verify their credentials.
Do your research.
Absolutely. Before you trust them with your case.
Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah.
And make sure you feel good about the person who's handling everything.
Exactly, yeah.
All right, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about some specific immigration programs. The NIJC resources cover a lot, from asylum and temporary protected status, that's TPS, to DACA and U visas. So these are some of the
main pathways.
The main ways people can seek legal status.
Yeah, for sure.
Or protection in the U.S. So let's start with asylum and TPS. What's the big difference between those two?
Well, asylum is granted to people who have a very real fear of persecution, back in their home country, based on things like race, religion, political opinion.
So it's for people who are fleeing danger.
Exactly, yeah. They're escaping some kind of oppression or harm.
And then TPS?
TPS is a little different. It's more temporary. And it's offered to people from certain countries that are going through a crisis, like an armed conflict or a major natural disaster.
So it's about providing a safe haven.
Exactly, a temporary safe haven.
And then are there cases where someone might be eligible for both?
Yeah, there are definitely cases where someone might qualify for both asylum and TPS. It really depends on their specific situation.
Right, okay. Now what about DACA? The NIJC mentions a court decision from just this past January.
Oh, right, yeah, that was a big one.
That impacted work authorization for DACA recipients.
Yeah, so the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals basically said that while DACA itself can remain in place, the Biden administration's rules from 2022 about DACA recipients being able to apply for work permits, those rules were unlawful.
So what does that mean for the people who are already here under DACA and need those work permits?
Well, it creates a lot of uncertainty. Throws their ability to legally work and support themselves into question. It's a tough situation for a lot of folks.
It's not really resolved.
No, not yet. It just highlights how much DACA is still being debated and the need for a more permanent solution.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about U visas. What are those? And there's some new procedure, I think, that the NIJC mentioned.
Yeah, so U visas are specifically for victims of certain crimes. People who have been through substantial abuse and who have helped law enforcement with investigations or prosecutions.
So it's about protecting those who have been through something really traumatic.
Right, and who have been brave enough to help bring the perpetrators to justice.
And what about this new procedure?
So the new procedure is called the bona fide determination procedure. And it basically clarifies the requirements for proving that someone is a legitimate victim, of these qualifying crimes.
So it's about making sure the process is fair.
Exactly. Making sure the people who really need protection are able to get it.
Right. So it's another example of how the NIJC is working to advocate for immigrants' rights and make the system more transparent. So we've covered a lot today, from the very basic rights to all these specific programs, and how to avoid scams. I mean, it's pretty clear that navigating this whole U.S. immigration system can feel overwhelming. What would you say to someone who's feeling lost or intimidated by all of this?
It's understandable to feel that way. But I think that's exactly why the NIJC's Know Your Rights resources are so valuable. They break down these complex issues into smaller, easier to understand pieces, and they give you real, practical advice that you can actually use.
Right, so it's not just like a bunch of legal jargon.
No, it's really about empowering people to understand their options.
And they even have a guide specifically for newcomers to Chicago.
Oh, yeah, that one's great.
Really shows their commitment to local communities.
Yeah, it's so important to have that local focus because
Yeah.
immigration is different depending on where you are.
It's not a one-size-fits-all.
Okay.
So if you had to pick one main takeaway from all this,
I would say the most important thing is knowing that knowledge is power. The more you understand about your rights, about the different options available to you, and about the potential traps to avoid, the better equipped you'll be to navigate this whole process.
yeah, it's about feeling empowered, not intimidated.
Exactly.
And the NIJC's website is a great resource for all of this.
Oh, absolutely. We've just scratched the surface here. I mean, if you want to really dig deep into any specific topic, I highly recommend checking out their website. They have tons of in-depth guides and resources.
Okay, so it's like a roadmap
Yeah, think of it as your guide.
to help you through this whole process.
Exactly.
And don't be afraid to ask for help.
Right. There are so many organizations out there, like the NIJC and others, that are dedicated to supporting immigrants and advocating for their rights.
Yeah, so even though the system can feel really daunting, there are people out there who can make a difference.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the legal complexities. But at the end of the day, there's hope, there's support, and there's a path forward.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into U.S. immigration law. We hope you feel more informed and empowered. To navigate this complex system, remember knowledge is your greatest asset. And knowing your rights is the first step towards a brighter future. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, it really is about having those safeguards in place.
Yeah.
And it kind of brings us to another big point, which is that immigration law, it's always changing. It's so dynamic.
Yeah.
So these NIJC resources, they're constantly being updated, which is really important, right?
It can be so hard to keep up with all the changes.
It really can, yeah. One thing that I noticed recently that kind of stood out to me was a court ruling on the parole in place program. The one for military families.
Okay.
It was actually vacated back in November 2024.
Wow, so that's pretty recent.
Yeah, very recent.
What does that mean for the families who are depending on that program?
Well, it's definitely a setback for them.
Yeah.
Parole in place was designed to help, spouses and children of military personnel. So now that it's been vacated, it leaves them in a really uncertain position.
So what happens now? Are there any other options for those families?
Well, it's a complex situation, for sure. The NIJC is keeping a close eye on any new developments. There may be appeals, legal challenges, that kind of thing. But for now, it's kind of waiting game.
Yeah, it's a lot of uncertainty hanging over them.
Definitely.
It really emphasizes the importance of having good legal guidance. Speaking of which, the NIJC has a whole guide on avoiding immigration fraud, which is, something that's probably on a lot of people's minds.
Oh, yeah, that's a huge issue. I mean, unfortunately, there are people who take advantage of folks who are just trying to figure things out.
So how can people protect themselves from those scams?
Well, one of the biggest red flags is if someone guarantees you a specific outcome. Immigration law is just so complicated. No one can promise you a particular result. And then another thing to watch out for is the qualifications of the people offering legal services.
Right, so how do you know who's legitimate?
The NIJC makes a distinction between attorneys and accredited representatives.
So what's the difference there?
Attorneys are licensed by, state bar associations, and accredited representatives are authorized by the Department of Justice.
Okay.
So both can provide legal help. But it's really important to make sure that whoever you're working with is actually qualified.
Yeah, do your research.
Absolutely. Ask questions. Make sure you feel comfortable with the person handling your case.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit now and talk about some of the specific immigration programs out there. The NIJC covers a lot, asylum, temporary protected status, which is also known as TPS, DACA, U visas.
Yeah, those are some of the big ones for sure.
So these are like the main ways someone might be able to seek legal status in the U.S.
Or at least some kind of protection.
Okay, so let's start with asylum and TPS. What's the main difference between those two?
Well, asylum is granted to people who have a well-founded fear of persecution. If they were to return to their home country, based on things like their race, religion, political opinion.
So it's really about protecting people who are fleeing danger.
Exactly.
TPS
is a little different. It's more temporary. And it's offered to people from countries that are experiencing, maybe an armed conflict or a serious natural disaster.
It's more about providing a safe place during a crisis.
Exactly.
And are there times when someone might qualify for both?
Yeah, it's possible. Depending on the situation, someone might be eligible for both asylum and TPS.
Okay, interesting. What about DACA? The NIJC mentions a court decision from January of this year that affected work authorization for DACA recipients.
Oh, yeah, that was a big ruling. The Fifth Circuit basically said that while DACA itself can stay in place, the Biden administration's 2022 rules about DACA recipients applying for work permits, those were unlawful.
Okay, so what does that mean for DACA recipients now?
Well, it creates a lot of uncertainty. It means that their ability to work legally and support themselves is now in question.
That's a tough spot to be in.
It really is. It just shows that the legal battles over DACA are still ongoing. And we need a real lasting solution for these folks.
Okay, and finally, let's talk about U visas. What are those? And I think the NIJC mentions a new procedure.
Right. So U visas are specifically for victims of certain crimes.
Yeah.
Who've experienced substantial abuse and who've helped law enforcement with investigations or prosecutions.
So it's about protecting those who have been through some really difficult things and who have been brave enough to come forward.
Right.
And what about this new procedure?
It's called the Bona Fide Determination Procedure.
No.
It was issued back in June of 2021, and it basically clarifies the requirements for establishing that someone is a legitimate victim of these qualifying crimes.
Okay, so it's about making sure the process is fair.
Exactly.
And that the people who need this protection are able to get it. So it's just another example of how the NIJC is really working to advocate for immigrants' rights.
Yeah, and to make the system more transparent and accessible.
So we've talked about a lot of heavy stuff today, from basic rights to specific programs to avoiding scams. I mean, it's clear that navigating the U.S. immigration system can be really overwhelming. What would you say to someone who's feeling lost or intimidated by all of this?
Yeah, it could be a lot for sure.
It can definitely feel like a maze.
Totally.
And I think that's where those Know Your Rights resources from the NIJC are really helpful.
Absolutely.
They take all this complicated stuff and make it easier to understand.
Yeah, they really break things down.
And give you like actual advice you can use.
Real practical advice.
Not just legal jargon.
Right, exactly.
They even have a guide specifically for people who are new to Chicago.
Yeah, that's a great one.
It shows how much they care about helping local communities.
It's so important to have that local focus because immigration isn't the same everywhere.
Right, right. What works in one place might not work somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you had to pick one main takeaway from all this, what would it be?
Well, I would say the most important thing is just remembering that knowledge is power.
Yeah.
The more you know about your rights, the different options that are available to you, and the things you need to watch out for, the better you'll be able to handle this whole process.
It's about feeling empowered, not intimidated.
Exactly.
And like you said, the NIJC's website has a ton of information.
Oh, yeah, we've just scratched the surface here.
Like a roadmap.
Think of it as your guide.
To help you find your way through this.
Absolutely.
And don't be afraid to reach out for help either.
Yeah, there are so many organizations out there, like the NIJC, who are there to support immigrants.
So even though it can seem really scary, there are people who want to help.
Absolutely. It's easy to get lost in all the legal stuff.
Right.
But ultimately, there is hope, there's support, and there's a path forward.
That's a great way to put it. Thank you so much for joining us today. For this deep dive into U.S. immigration law, we hope you feel more informed and empowered to navigate this complex system. Remember, knowledge is your greatest asset, and knowing your rights is the first step towards a brighter future. Thanks for listening.